Hi ladies and gentlemen, Joel Hunter here. We are going to be talking about 11 arguments against moral objectivity. And this is the summation of the part on meta-ethics that's in your text. And it really brings together a number of arguments that you're actually going to see when we go back in the text and we look at specific normative theories in part 2. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of the 11 arguments that are in this chapter. What I'm going to do is spend some time on the first one, showing you how you do the analysis. Now, your author does this for you in each of the arguments, but what is beneficial is for you to learn how to do it on your own. And so I'm going to show you how to do that. This is a great and important skill in doing philosophy, where you are identifying arguments and then you're analyzing them, evaluating them for validity and soundness. Now that is something that I told you to be especially alert to when you read the introduction. So hopefully you're already prepared for this and have had some practice. You might want to look before you go through chapter 21, is go back to the introduction and read pages 9 through 15 again to become familiar with that vocabulary of logic, so that it won't trip you up when we go over this and when you read it in chapter 21. Okay, so with that said, let's get right to the chapter and start with the first argument, the argument from absolutism. And so what I'm going to do is I'll just read the argument as it's given in your text, and then I'll say a couple words about it. But on this first one, what we're going to do is actually dig into it and analyze it. And this is exactly the sort of thing I want you to be able to do on your own. Okay, so first argument is, premise 1 is, if moral claims are objectively true, then moral rules are absolute. Premise 2, no moral rule is absolute. And from those two premises, then, it is claimed that it follows, therefore, moral claims are not objectively true. So just as a reminder, the first two sentences are premises. So those are propositions that are made about either a general moral principle or some factual claims. And then the third sentence is the conclusion. It is what is supposedly follows if those two premises are true. Okay. And so what we can do is, just to show you that it's this is a formal structure that the argument has. It's called a syllogism. And you can take variables and substitute them in for the content of the claim, so that you can then evaluate the structure of the argument and see whether it's valid. Okay, so if you look at the first one, that is what's called a hypothetical claim, and it's of the structure if P, then Q. And then the second premise has the form of not Q. So you notice that the P refers to the chunk of the first sentence that says moral claims are objectively true. Okay, so P equals moral claims are objectively true. That's that piece. Q is moral rules are absolute. Okay? So the second premise is saying, well, it's not the case that Q. In other words, it's not the case that moral rules are absolute, or no moral rule is absolute. So it's denying Q, right? It's negating it. So then, if those two premises are true, it follows that it is not the case that P, or it is not the case that moral claims are objectively true. See how that works? So just to summarize then, the argument in this formal presentation is if P, then Q, and not Q, therefore not P. Now, this is called a modus or modus tollens syllogism. It's a very common argumentative structure. So it is a logically valid argument. It's deductive in its shape. In other words, the conclusion has to be true if the two premises are true. And it tells you that then this argument, because of its valid structure, is truth preserving. Okay? But the million-dollar question is it sound? Now, sound is where we want to know whether, in fact, the two premises are true. And that's what you are testing. So first you test to make sure that the argument structure is valid, that the conclusion actually follows from the premises. Then you test for soundness. Then you investigate, well, do we have good reasons to think that these premises are true? Or are there sort of obvious objections to the premises that would make them implausible or even false? So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to come back to the argument. So you have two premises. What you do then is you check the two premises and you test them to see whether they are in fact true. So if we start, just as your author does, with the second premise, no moral rule is absolute. So we can think about that and think about, okay, let's think of some moral rules like prohibitions on rape or prohibitions on murdering innocent individuals. If there are absolute moral rules, those would be probably good candidates. I guess we can't be sure that they are absolute. In other words, remember, absolute means without exception. So they cannot be what? If you fail to follow such a moral rule, an absolute moral rule, then it's always morally wrong. So is it the case that those are? Well, those are pretty strong candidates for absolute moral rules. But we could say, well, maybe in certain circumstances there would be legitimate exceptions to those rules, as implausible as that may be. Let's just set that one aside and check the first premise. If moral claims are objectively true, then moral rules are absolute. Okay, this is the claim then that connects the objectivity of a moral claim to the moral rule being absolute. Okay, so remember, objective means independent of a subject, means mind independent. In other words, its truth does not depend on whether I know that it's true or believe that it's true or hope that it's true or anything like that. It's true independent of that. Okay, so ignorance, in other words, would be no excuse. So are moral claims objectively true? Well, if they are, the claim here is, if they are, then they're also absolute. Okay, so that connection is the weakness. It does not follow that just because a moral claim is objectively true, mind independent, not dependent on a subject, non-relative, it does not follow that that the moral rule is absolute also. Okay, so that is the case. So example is, I can make a moral claim about that in such and such a case that it would be wrong to kill innocents for pleasure. Okay, and I can identify a specific situation to kill for pleasure, right? That is I'm going to say that moral claim is objectively true. Then is the moral rule that is founded on, is that absolute? It doesn't follow that it is, right? So it can be, I'm trying to think of an example of that. Okay, so there's a story called The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell, and it's a story about a guy who is shipwrecked on an island, who becomes on a deserted island, except there's this one madman who lives there, who enjoys capturing sailors who get shipwrecked and hunting them for sport. Okay, so that's exactly the sort of thing I have in mind here, is that, is it objectively true that it's wrong to hunt human beings for sport? Okay. Does that depend on my culture? Does it depend on, my taste, whether I, have a ooh factor or ick factor about that or not? Well, that's not what the claim is. The claim is if that moral claim is objectively true, that it would be wrong for this individual to hunt this guy who is shipwrecked on his island, then moral rules are absolute, that it's always wrong to do that. It just doesn't follow. Okay, so the weakness in this argument is the first premise. First premise is false. The connection, the logical link there just doesn't follow. Okay, so that means that this argument is valid, but it is unsound. Okay? So that's how this works, is you examine each of the two premises, or there may only be one premise. Not all arguments obviously have two premises, but you examine each premise in an argument, and then you determine, what is the, whether they're sound or not, whether the argument is sound or not, based on the plausibility and truth of each premise. So notice I didn't have to really take a stand on premise number 2 in this one. The moral rule is, no moral rule is absolute, sorry. I can just simply grant that that's true, and then attack the first premise, which is the weaker one. Okay. So next is the argument against objective truths. This only has one premise, notice. So the first claim is there are no objective truths. And from that, it follows there are no objective moral truths. Okay, so it doesn't seem like much of an argument here, but this is the idea that all truth is subjective. That's what this argument is saying against, then, objective truth. There's this is like a skepticism. This is expressing a skepticism that is global. It's not a special problem for morality. It actually would apply to mathematical truths and scientific truths, things that have different criteria for being verified as objective. So that is sort of a universal solvent here. It just eliminates that kind of skepticism. It eliminates all kinds of truths that can claim to be objective. And so notice what happens, though, in this argument is the premise is there are no objective truths. Now, premise is either true or false. If this premise is false, then we can disregard the argument, because then the conclusion doesn't matter what the conclusion is. This would be an unsound argument. However, suppose that the premise is true. There are no objective truths. Well, if there are no objective truths, then does that include this particular premise? In other words, is it objectively true that there are no objective truths? Okay, so it becomes then self-vitiating, what we call it. In other words, it's a premise that, if true, negates itself, and so it becomes then impossible. So the premise cannot be true, because if it were, there would be at least one objective truth, namely that premise. Okay? So that argument we can dispense with. Argument number 3, the argument from equal rights. And this is equating then that if it is the case that there are equal rights, then moral claims have equal plausibility. So let's look at that. If everyone has an equal right to an opinion, then all opinions are equally plausible. Everyone does have an equal right to his or her moral opinions. Therefore, all moral opinions are equally plausible. Okay, notice what happens in this argument here is the third sentence is a conclusion. However, it's a provisional conclusion. It doesn't get us to the ultimate claim we want to get to, which is that moral objectivity is false. So what we have to do then is make number 3, if that is true, then that becomes a premise for the rest of the argument. So 3 and 4 then become premises. Okay, so the first thing that the arguer has to do is establish the truth of 3. It does that with premises 1 and 2. And then 3 and 4 taken together to prove premise 5, statement 5. So let's suppose, just to keep going here with this argument, all moral opinions are equally plausible. Let's now enter that into as a premise that's true. And then 4, if all moral opinions are equally plausible, then ethical objectivism is false. Therefore, ethical objectivism is false. So you see how 3 and 4 together make 5 to be true, right? So what's to say about this? Well, which premise would you attack? Okay, we would want to, I think, set aside number 4, because number 4, that seems kind of obviously true. There doesn't seem to be a problem with that. So the question then is 3 true? Well, for 3 to be true, 1 and 2 have to be true. Remember, 3 is a conclusion of 1 and 2. Okay, So let's look at then premises 1 and 2. Well, what about everyone has an equal right to his or her moral opinions? Now, that doesn't seem particularly problematic, because, I mean, I can imagine somebody who has noxious moral opinions, but I wouldn't necessarily say that they don't have an equal right to them as someone who has good moral opinions. So maybe not 2. I guess the question then is 1 true? Okay, so that's, again, just to illustrate the process that you go through to think through it. Okay, so check out premise number 1 and test that. Analyze it and see if there is a weakness with premise 1. Okay, good. So next, the argument from dogmatism. If there are objective moral standards, then this makes dogmatism acceptable. Dogmatism is unacceptable. Therefore, there are no objective moral standards. So this is an argument form called modus ponens. We actually saw it in the previous argument as well. This has the form, I'm just going to say it, I didn't have it laid out, is if P, then Q, and then the second sentence is P, it's asserting that P is true, and therefore 3 is Q. Okay? If there are objective moral standards, then this makes dogmatism acceptable. So it's connecting this idea that dogmatism follows from the view that there are objective moral standards. Okay, so remember, dogmatism is this, it's a belief about one's knowledge that, in this case, it would be infallible. So you are dogmatic if you believe that you can't possibly be wrong, that your knowledge on this particular subject is infallible, cannot be wrong. Okay? And so the opposite of that is, I just went blank. Well, it's fallibility, right? That I could be in error about this. And so the question then is, if there are objective moral standards, does it follow that dogmatism is acceptable? Okay? So, check that premise out. Next, tolerance is valuable. It's the argument from tolerance. And so the idea here is that, oh wow, if you believe that there are objective moral standards, then you also support you support intolerance. All right, so let's look at that argument. Tolerance is valuable only if the moral views of different people are equally plausible. Number 2, if ethical objectivism is true, then the moral views of different people are not equally plausible. Yeah. And then number 3, therefore, if ethical objectivism is true, then tolerance is not valuable. Okay, so this is a fun argument, and again, you can think about how the assumption built into this idea that the proper way to support tolerance is to support or to assume that all moral views are equally good. And if you can't see a problem with that, then just use your imagination a bit and, again, think about the moral opinions that some actually hold now or have been held in history, say about the human worth of a woman, for example. All right. Think of any other example you wish. That someone is it equally plausible for sexist moral opinions to be true? Okay. Well, if you tie tolerance to equal plausibility of moral views, as it does in premise 1, well, that's what you're sort of accepting as a result of that, is that very noxious moral opinions then are just as plausible as yours. So here is a way to turn this argument around. And so you can take tolerance and make it, or the principle of tolerance, and make it an argument against relativism, moral relativism. So look at premise 1. If all moral views are equally plausible, then moral views supporting tolerance and those supporting intolerance are equally plausible. Notice that sort of self-contradictory character of the original claim, going back here. tolerance is valuable only if the moral views of different people are equally plausible, including those who hold that intolerance is preferable to tolerance. Okay, so this first premise is sort of turning the previous first premise on its head. Okay, so then second premise is these moral views are not equally plausible. In other words, that a moral system that supports tolerance and a moral system that supports intolerance, that they're equally plausible. Okay, so the second premise is saying that's not the case. They're not equally plausible. Therefore, some moral views are less plausible than others. So that is an argument against moral relativism following from the principle of tolerance. Okay? Number 6. And of course, though your author thinks that this 5a is a better argument than 5, you, of course, you should try to do the same sort of analysis of the premises and test them, see whether they're true or false, right? So do that. Number 6, the argument from cultural variation. So, does moral objectivity allow for legitimate cultural differences? Okay. So if ethical objectivism is true, then all moral standards apply universally to everyone in every society. Okay. Some moral standards do not apply universally, but only in certain cultural or social contexts and not in others. Therefore, it follows that ethical objectivism is false. Okay. So here, what do you think the candidate is for the weak, or do you think there is a candidate that for a weak premise in this one, or even a false premise? So one way to test it is with some examples, like take a standard like showing respect for loved ones. Okay, that's your author's example. So you can imagine how the principle of you must show respect for your loved ones, how that might look in different cultures. So the question is, does the particular instance of how respect is shown, does that, if there are differences in the particular ways that respect is shown, does that then negate the underlying principle? Or is it, even though it may be performed differently in different cultures, is it actually the same principle underlying them both? So that would be something to test with for number, which one is it? Number 2, premise number 2. Okay? Right, so let's move on to number 7. Moral disagreement undermines moral objectivity. So this is a very common objection to the idea of moral objectivity, that is, existence of disagreement. So if well-informed, open-minded, rational people persistently disagree about some claim, then that claim cannot be objectively true. Well-informed, open-minded, rational people persistently disagree about all moral claims. Therefore, no moral claim can be objectively true. So the author does a nice job of, by analogy, taking premise 1 and showing how, okay, so this is not limited to moral claims. And necessarily so for this argument to work. So, well-informed, open-minded, rational people persistently disagree about how to reconcile gravitation and quantum theory. Okay, this is the realm of physics. So, does that mean that one of the several theories that are offered, say string theory, brain theory, or a theory that that are not reconcilable, does that mean that one of those cannot be objectively true? Of course not. It just means there's not enough information to make a decisive decision about which is objectively true. Okay, so there was a time, for example, when the heliocentric thesis, the idea that the Earth goes around the sun, and the geocentric thesis that the sun went around the Earth, there was a grounds for legitimate debate. Why? Because there just wasn't enough data at a certain point in history. Eventually, there was enough data that it could be determined that the heliocentric theory was objectively true. Okay, so if we consider this now in the realm of morality, what would that look like, that kind of disagreement? All right, so what it would look like is when you're trying to determine whether a moral claim is rightly considered objectively true, you would take into consideration as much of the relevant data as you can, okay? And that, and maybe the degree of agreement would make a difference there. Okay, so argument from disagreement. That one is dealt with nicely in your text. Argument from atheism. Okay, so premise number 1, morality can be objective only if God exists. Number 2, premise 2 is God does not exist. Premise 3, therefore morality cannot be objective. Very straightforward argument, valid, and then the question is it sound? Well, like we did with the first argument, you can take the second premise and just set it aside, okay, just grant it for the sake of argument, and look at the first premise. Morality can be objective only if God exists. Is that true? So the idea there, maybe a hidden assumption in that claim, is that all moral laws, or all laws in general, require a lawmaker, right? So it requires someone or something to have made the moral law and therefore make it objective. So in other words, independent of human choice and creation. Okay? So is that the case though? Well, maybe that assumption isn't necessary, but that seems to be behind the first premise there. So morality can be objective only if God exists. All right, so test that premise to see if it passes the test. Okay, number 9, the absence of categorical reasons undermines moral objectivity. If you don't remember what categorical reasons is, look it up in your glossary, go back to chapter 20 and review that. Categorical reasons are the justification for taking some sort of action or making a certain choice. If there are objective moral duties, then there are categorical reasons to obey them. Number 2, there are no categorical reasons. 3, therefore there are no objective moral duties. Okay, so here, what about a duty to repay loans? What about a duty, again, to be respectful of your loved ones? Those kinds of things, maybe you could find categorical reasons to do them. Remember, categorical reason does not depend on any kind of benefit to you. It doesn't depend on whether or not it fulfills your desires or makes you happy to do it. It's just required of you by duty. Okay, so think about, and there may not be many such moral rules, but let me see if I can quickly look at what he says. Okay, yeah, he gives you this example of, okay, so you're out hiking one day and you're passing somebody on the path, and they are, they're looking at their cell phone, checking, and you can tell that they are about to veer off a cliff and tumble to their death. Now, do you have a duty to warn them of the danger that faces them? Okay, you don't have to care. You don't have to know who it is. You don't have to care about them. You have to know them. You don't have to worry about, it doesn't have to be the fact that, you'll get a write-up in the newspaper and everybody will call you a hero. Even if none of that happens, do you have a duty to them? What are the categorical reasons then to doing that? Well, it would be things like the mutuality of that. You would want the same sort of consideration just because you're a fellow living human being, right? And you deserve a modicum of respect. In other words, if it can be, if it is possible to save your life just by warning you, then that justifies it. Okay. So is there something that favors doing that for its own sake, not for whether you want to do it or not, or whether you get anything out of it. Okay, so if you believe that morality is objective, you would have to cite some such reason, like respect for fellow human beings, you know, kind of like a golden rule kind of thing. You would have to give categorical reasons and show that they exist. Okay? All right. Number 10, the motivational argument. Here's another argument that has that sort of intermediary conclusion that becomes then a premise in the second half of the argument. So moral judgments are able, all by themselves, to motivate those who make them. Okay, number 2, beliefs are never able, all by themselves, to motivate those who hold them. Therefore, moral judgments are not beliefs. Okay, so we'll look at that now and take that as a premise. Moral judgments are not beliefs. 4, if moral judgments are not beliefs, then they can't be true. 5, therefore, moral judgments can't be true. Okay, well, right away, we can look at premise 4 and say, yeah, that's granted. Okay, that follows from the nature of beliefs. Yeah, beliefs are either true or false. So if moral judgments are not beliefs, then they can't be true. That's right, right? They do have to be, moral judgments do have to be beliefs to be either true or false. Okay, and so then if 3 is true, then the conclusion 5 follows. Okay, so now what we have to do is step back and look at 1 and 2 and see if number 3, if the intermediary conclusion holds up. And so what we would do is test premise 1 and premise 2. Okay? So yeah, have a look at that one and see what you think is the weak premise here. What would you say? Give me 5 seconds. So yeah, I mean, if you're a moral objectivist, you have to make a choice as to which of the 2 premises you were going to criticize. My view is, and I think your author's view is, that the first premise is the weakest candidate here, and so that would be the one to criticize. Although that comes with cost. So have a look at his analysis on 336 and 337, and see what you think. Whether maybe premise 2 is the one to criticize rather than premise 1. Okay, and then last but certainly not least, values have no place in a scientific world. The argument from the scientific test of reality. So premise 1, if science cannot verify the existence of X, then the best evidence tells us that X does not exist. Premise 2, science cannot verify the existence of objective moral values. Therefore, the best evidence tells us that objective moral values do not exist. Okay, a valid argument, once again, modus ponens, and the premise here that is least problematic is number 2. Science cannot verify the existence of objective moral values. That is not something that submits to the data of sense experience. It's not something that, that all the instruments of science in a lab that it can be studied. So it is not, moral values are not those kind of phenomena. So we have to look at what kind of phenomena they are. If science cannot verify the existence of X, then the best evidence tells us that X does not exist. Well, if you look at the natural world, one way to challenge premise 1 is to say, well, no, there are moral features in the natural world. Okay, and this is underneath what's called natural law theory, at least in its contemporary versions. It's it's non-theistic version of natural law theory. This is moral naturalism, that moral laws can be read off the order of nature. Okay, but usually that involves some sort of goal-directed beliefs about nature, some sort of what philosophers call teleological, that there are certain intrinsic purposes or goals toward which natural principles and laws tend. Okay? So, you know, a moral naturalist could claim lots of different things about, say, values, about that the pursuit of happiness, for example, is something that follows from our nature as humans. Okay, so there are a couple different ways that you can reply to this argument. So if you accept that science is the ultimate and even sole authority for determining truth, test of reality, then you probably would accept number one, and then you would challenge premise number two. So that would then get you into the moral naturalist position. Probably the more common response, though, is to challenge the scientism. It's an epistemological belief that is that upholds premise number one, that idea that only scientific truths are unassailable, and that are the ultimate test of reality. So most challenges will attempt to draw attention to the fact that moral features are norms. They are not facts. They are norms. They tell how things ought to be, like justice, for example, you know, or how we should behave. They are not descriptive. They're not saying how we do behave, although that would be part of a moral argument. They're not saying what is the case about the world, although of course we need to know that in order to know what is the right and wrong thing to do in response to those facts. But that the first premise is rejected typically by drawing out this distinction between facts and norms, or facts and values, and showing that it's incorrect to reduce the truth of norms to be equivalent to the truth of facts, that or to be evaluated in the same way that you evaluate the truth of facts. Okay, so that would be, let me see. Notice, by the way, if we take premise number one and we can restate it as a simple claim, which your author does in 340. A claim is true only if science can verify it. Okay, so let's just make that assertion there for premise number one. It seems to be saying that, right? So that's scientism. That's the epistemological view that only science is the arbiter of truth. So a claim is true only if science can verify it. Now, notice that once you make that claim, that you can that it is one of those self-contradictory claims, because how do you test the claim that a claim is true only if science can verify it? Where's the scientific test of that? How can it be objectively true with the data of sense experience? You know, how can it be seen and felt and heard? Okay, so it's a philosophical claim that underlies scientism, that underlies this specific claim. It's not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement. You can't test its truth by what you taste and what you hear and what you feel or what you smell. You can't mathematically test it. There's no algorithm for it. There are no lab experiments to confirm it. So it would seem then that the claim that claim is true only if science can verify it is false. Self-vitiating claim. Okay, so then your author considers one other version of the same argument, but I think that's enough for now. We've stepped through each of the 11 arguments, and you can see that your author, wants to sort of present kind of common views about why moral objectivity is believed to be false. You probably more than one of those sound really familiar to you or seem intuitively right to you. But then, each of them has some serious flaws. And so if it is the case that moral objectivity is false, we need better arguments than those 11, even though those 11 are the most common. That's the bottom line for this reading. So now we're going to go back with sort of this strange way to, to sort of reassert the plausibility, maybe even the likelihood of moral objectivity. Now we go back and we look at values, and we look at value theory, and we look at normative theory with that in the background, and we'll see how each of those theories are their own version of a moral that asserts a moral objectivity or assumes moral objectivity. Okay, so that's it, and we'll see you next time for chapters 1 and 2.